Kia ora koutou. My name is Dr. Caitlin Drinkwater, and today I'm presenting on my thesis, which was titled Life on the Gender Border. So this thesis was an exploration of the lived experiences of people who identify as non-binary. Trans people came into prominence about 70 years ago. This prominence began with Christine Jorgensen, who has been erroneously described as the first trans woman in 1952, all the way through to Elliot Page, who came out last year. But typically, the popular understanding of transgender is quite binary. Trans people are understood as being people who are born men or women and come out as the opposite gender and then live in fairly normative roles of this identified gender. But what about people who don't fit this presentation? For example, Leslie Feinberg, a writer and activist from the 20th century, who transitioned to live as a man before ceasing to take hormones and instead using she, her pronouns. Also, there is Sam Smith, a popular singer who was assigned male at birth but uses they, them pronouns and has a gender non-conforming presentation. Both of these people identify themselves as being non-binary, a subsection of the trans community that is growing in prominence. Before I move into the study, it's best to define what I mean when I use this term. Non-binary is an umbrella term that is used to define those who do not fit binary gender categories of male and female. Non-binary is a label that covers a broad range of distinct gender identities, which include gender fluid, where someone describes themselves as having a gender identity that shifts over time, or agender, where someone describes having an absence of a gender identity. People who identify as non-binary are seen as making up a significant proportion of the trans community, with one study finding that of 6,438 trans people who were surveyed, 36% of them use a non-binary label. While there's been a long history of non-conformity to gender, the label of non-binary is relatively new. Historically, deviation from binary gender identity was treated as pathological, and transitioning was treated as a way to enable trans people to help more easily conform to a normative gender presentation. In the late 20th century, there was an emergence of voices within the community who began to tell their own stories of how they felt that they did not fit into male or female. This led to new language and narratives that emerged from outside of medical discourse around gender diversity and came to be known as non-binary gender identity. At this point, research into the non-binary gender identity community is quite limited, so we wanted to do analysis of how someone becomes aware of having a non-binary gender identity in a world that is heavily binary gendered. Following on from this, we also wanted to understand how a non-binary person expresses their identity in a world which is frequently divided into male or female. We also wanted to ask about what challenges non-binary people face in their everyday lives, and how they navigated them. I felt it was important that this research takes a collaborative approach that centers the voices of participants. To help encourage this, a photo elicitation method was used. Photo elicitation is a method where photographs are used to generate discussion between the interviewer and the participant. This is shown to be useful in generating richer discussion. The study also required participants to take their own photos to help encourage them to be a more active participant in the research, while also helping to focus the study on the participant's perspective. While photography was a crucial part of the research process, the focus was on the analysis and not on the photographs themselves, and more on the discussions that were generated. For the study, we recruited 10 participants, and we recruited them through online methods, and this was using ads in trans and non-binary Facebook groups. The age ranged from about 16 to 54. And we had 9 participants that were assigned female at birth and 1 participant assigned male at birth. I think it's also important to note these interviews were conducted in 2017. Following the interviews, the transcripts were analyzed. We decided to do a narrative analysis rather than a thematic analysis, as it felt that 10 participants could not accurately represent a population that was as heterogeneous as non-binary people. The process of narrative analysis was informed by Murray and involved constructing a coherent timeline using quotes from the interview. Following this, the narratives were reanalyzed and several common milestones in the narratives were identified. The first of these was the pre-coming out identity, which refers to the stage before the participant came out and was aware of themselves being non-binary. The second stage is developing awareness of oneself as non-binary, more commonly known as the coming out process. And the third stage is living as non-binary, which looks at how the participants interacted with the world as a non-binary person. So from looking at these narratives, we can make several observations. One of which is gender dysphoria, the discomfort that some trans people feel between their assigned gender and identified gender. What came through in the narratives was a distinction between physical dysphoria, which is felt in the body, and social dysphoria, which is a dissatisfaction with the social role that people found themselves placed in. Some participants expressed more physical dysphoria, which we can see in this first quote. I want to transition fully to masculine because that's how I identify on the inside. I identify more with the masculine frame, even though I would say my behavior and the way I think is stereotypically more feminine. And then the second quote, which shows a participant who had quite minimal physical dysphoria. And when we discussed transition, they stated that they had no intention of doing so. I don't think I will, because for me, my idea of gender is rooted in my perception of myself, and I don't have issues with my body. So for this person, they saw their gender as being kind of distinct from their body, whereas the first participant viewed their physical self as being an important part for how their gender functioned. So when we looked at the participants, there were two dominant narratives which emerged. The first was the unable to fit narrative, which was this feeling of not being able to fit into the gender role that was assigned by society. So this is a quote from one participant who portrayed this. I would look to see how females were perceived. I would try to be like that. And it didn't work because people would often say to me, oh, you're a bit of a freak, aren't you? So this feeling of trying to conform, but not being able to fit in. The second narrative was the accepted nonconformist narrative. So with this, we had a participant who stated, I was very tomboy in growing up. You didn't mind getting dirty and things like that. I was an honorary guy in a group of guys at school. So this is this idea of always being gender non-conforming, but non-binary being an accurate way that they're able to describe that to the world. I think it's also important to point out that these two aren't mutually exclusive. And this final quote portrays that, which shows one person who, before coming out as non-binary, identified in the rainbow community. And they found that even though they were in a community that was more open to gender diversity, they still felt pressure to conform to like quite normative stereotypes around gender. And they really wanted to identify outside of that. So when looking at developing awareness of oneself as non-binary, all of the participants describe this lifelong experience of being gender non-conforming or not fitting into the gender binary. However, all participants also came out within a decade preceding the interview. And they often cited the heightened visibility of gender and sexual diversity and awareness of narratives around non-binary as being a precursor to coming out. And finally, living as non-binary. All the participants, early models of trans identity have focused on the trans person having an early period of gender non-conformity and trying to find themselves before moving towards a more stable sense of gender identity. And that was seen as the norm per se. Non-binary people, at least the ones in my sample, didn't really describe that. For them, presenting as non-binary was something that required active maintenance to kind of constantly be seen and interpreted in the world as a non-binary person. A lot of non-binary participants talked about how there was a pressure to conform and fit into like these a male, female gender role. One participant stated, I feel like I've picked a path of gender of least resistance and gone, okay, whatever, I can deal with this. So it's this idea of moving towards a more binary gender presentation, just to basically get through life a little bit easier, to face less harassment. So when we're looking at the results of my study, I had several conclusions. The first was that participants experience physical and social gender dysphoria as separate constructs. and varied in how they experienced this. The second conclusion was that participants discovered their non-binary identity following a rejection of social pressures or through some innate long-standing experience of being gender non-conforming. We can also see the expression of a non-binary identity requires active maintenance. And all of the participants identified that coming out as non-binary was important in affirming their sense of identity. So when we're looking at the implications from the study, we can see that understanding and recognizing the identities of non-binary people is important to their well-being. And I think like something that we can look at is making more accommodations in society for this. So this can include institutional changes like gender-neutral language or further education for community and service providers. And I think also looking at when we're looking at gender-affirming healthcare or processes around transition, that healthcare needs to be more individualized to meet the individual person's needs, rather than expecting them to conform to a particular gender role. There were some limitations to the study. First of all, there was a low representation of assigned male at birth participants, and I feel that future studies could benefit from exploring this further. I also want to acknowledge it was a majority patriarch sample, and that many of the participants, we could benefit from looking at other cultures and seeing kind of what their experiences of gender and the narratives in their own culture, how they impact on their own understanding of non-binary gender identity. And that's all we have time for. Here's my email if you have any questions. Thank you.